This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 945 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you that even though you drafted your fantasy teams back in August, you can still do snake drafts right now over on Underdog. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. In the draft section, click NFL. You'll see tons of drafts that you can participate in right now. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus, as well as my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are updated for you each Tuesday once you get the link to them. But to get them, you have to sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. Now let's get to these questions. The first question is from Patreon, from Mitstradamus. It says, as someone who doesn't own any Tampa Bay backs, can you quickly explain the difference between Irving and White and what separates them? Do you see one or both of them ascending from here on out due to the favorable schedule? Yeah, so first off, you're right. The Tampa Bay running back schedule, it's great rest of season. My numbers have it at number 1 in the league, and it's number 3 in the fantasy playoffs. They get the Cowboys and the Panthers in weeks 16 and 17. And I think those games are going to favor Bucky Irving more than Rachaad White. We can kind of put Sean Tucker out of the picture because he hasn't been getting a whole lot of work since that breakout against the Saints. But White has seen a 36% running back rush share per game over his last 4. He's also seen a 15% target share per game rate. Bucky Irving, he's at a 50% running back rush share. His target share is 10.5%. They've deployed Rachaad White more as a receiver. According to Fantasy Life, during this time frame, he's played 86% of their long down and distance snaps. Bucky Irving's only at 12%. White's beating Irving 50% to 32% in route participation during this time. Essentially, we're going to get more work on the ground from Irving and more work through the air from Rachaad White. But here's the thing. During this stretch, this 4-game period that I'm looking at, the Buccaneers have faced the Ravens, the Falcons, the Chiefs, and the 49ers. They've been incredibly competitive in those games, but those games have also favored Rachaad White, just given everything that I'm talking about here. If they're in a neutral or a negative game script, which they've been at times over the last month, that's going to favor White. That's why I like Irving more than White rest of season. Not only could they just want to feature him more because he's a rookie, but he's been better than White in pretty much every rushing metric. Not only that, but target shares will be shifted a little bit once Mike Evans returns. But the big thing is just look at the schedule. It's winnable game after winnable game. It's the potential for a lot of positive game scripts. They get the Giants, Panthers, Raiders, Chargers, Cowboys, and Panthers to end the fantasy season. They could easily be favorites in all but one of those games, which to me favors Bucky Irving more than Rachaad White. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from Andre. It says, hey JJ, have you started looking at defenses for the playoffs? What are your recommendations? Thanks. So I'm sure I'll bring this up again in the future, but looking at my numbers, here's what I've got. Now, I don't think you absolutely need to have a set and forget defense through all of the weeks in the fantasy playoffs. But there are a few who have good playoff matchups in total. One of them is Cincinnati. The Bengals get the Titans, Browns, and Broncos in weeks 15, 16, and 17. That could be worse. Another is Green Bay. They get the Seahawks, Saints, and Vikings. I think the defense with the best fantasy playoff schedule, though, has to be Indianapolis. They get the Broncos, then the Titans, and then the Giants. But you're unlikely going to need to just play one defense throughout the fantasy playoffs. Those are the only 3 teams with 3+ matchups in the 3 playoff weeks by adjusted points allowed. And some of those matchups aren't obvious great matchups on paper. What I would do is maybe focus on the first 2 weeks of the playoffs first. Weeks 15 and 16. You have to win those to play in week 17 in the first place. And in week 15 and 16, you could go with Cincinnati, but Atlanta's another team who's kind of intriguing. They get the Raiders and then the Giants. And then you can kind of play by matchup in week 17, which you have to remember, you'll have less competition on the waiver wire for those defenses that week because more teams have been eliminated. In most leagues, teams aren't going to be looking at the waiver wire if they're out of it. So yeah, those are some rough ideas here in week 11. Be sure to listen to 15 Transactions because I'm going to talk about this more on those episodes moving forward too. And there are other defenses that you could look at too. I just wanted to give you guys some defenses who could be good across multiple weeks instead of Frankensteining one together right now, because I'm not sure how helpful that is when we're over a month away. This next question is from Blue Sky, which again, I am over on Blue Sky, same handle as Twitter, @LateRoundQB. This is from King Mamba. It says, "Hey JJ, love the show. Thanks. What are your thoughts on JK Dobbins rest of season with Gus Edwards coming back? I worry his value takes a hit because Gus will take most of the goal line carries and already took half of the carries in general during his first game back. Thanks." So I don't know if Edwards is just going to take on all of the goal line carries. In fact, look at the goal line last week. They had 3 running back rushes. JK Dobbins had 2 of them. Hassan Haskins had the other one. It's not like JK Dobbins is just never going to see a goal line rush ever again. I think we often look at that kind of thing in too binary of a way. But yeah, I think Edwards being there does hurt Dobbins' upside rest of season. You could argue that it's going to keep Dobbins healthier, so that's your optimistic way of viewing this, that if Dobbins were to maintain his backfield share without Edwards, he would inevitably have gotten hurt. But Dobbins saw a 56% running back rush share in week 10. That was his lowest since week 2, which was with Gus Edwards. Now, the good news is that Dobbins still saw really good route participation. And maybe that gets a little bit better with Edwards active, because Kamani Vidal could be considered more of a threat as a receiver, and Edwards is more of a threat on the ground, which means if the Chargers are going to decrease Dobbins' ground game workload, they may increase his receiving workload, or at least give him a little bit more sustainability there. Because there have been times this season where his route share has dipped below that 50% mark, like well below it. So I would say that Edwards being back, it's a downgrade for Dobbins in some. But I think there are still some positives to take away here. He may not break down as easily now, and there may be more work for him as a receiver. It just really depends on how you want to frame this. Now, I only have one more question for you, but it's a deep dive. And I think it's kind of interesting. I hope you guys find it interesting too. But this one's also from Blue Sky. It's from Ben. It says, "How do you see this year's tight end debacle affecting how we view top tight ends next season?" And for the record, top is in quotes, as if we don't have top tight ends. So you guys might remember, but earlier in the season, when tight ends were performing like absolute garbage, I talked about the position on a Mailbag episode. Essentially, what I found was that yes, the position was not doing very well, but it wasn't for the reasons that some thought. Really, their percent of pass catcher PPR points was pretty similar to what we've typically seen over the last 10 years. Their target share wasn't that bad. Teams were using tight ends the way they typically do, at a high level. The biggest difference was touchdowns. In weeks 1 and 2, tight ends accounted for just 12% of all receiving touchdowns. Dating back to 2014, so the last decade, the lowest mark that we had seen through the first 2 weeks was 18%. Some years, we were up to 35%. But what happened in weeks 3 to 18 or weeks 3 to 17 in some seasons was regression. The seasons where tight end touchdown shares started slow, they saw an increase in touchdown share from week 3 through the end of the year. During the seasons in weeks 1 and 2, when touchdown shares at tight end were really high, guess what happened? They regressed. Their touchdown shares dropped from week 3 through the end of the year. The opposite happened. All of this data is published in a thread on Twitter. It's also talked about in the 3rd Mailbag episode of the regular season. When tight ends aren't scoring as many touchdowns, because remember, passing was also down to start the year. But when touchdowns are down, then obviously fantasy points are going to be down. And since tight ends don't have as many receptions, as many yards as wide receivers do, then that means that touchdowns make up a larger proportion of tight end scores in fantasy football. So if they're scoring less, which they were after week 2, they had 8 total receiving touchdowns through the first 2 weeks of the season. The lowest number since 2014 prior to this year was 16 touchdowns through the first 2 weeks. If they're scoring fewer touchdowns, that would be impacting their bottom line a lot. Like even more so than what we'd see from wide receivers. Because touchdowns make up a larger proportion of a tight end score. And I think that fantasy managers have an anchoring bias with that. because things haven't been nearly as bad since. Regression's hit. It hasn't been quite as good as we'd want. I'm not trying to paint this as like a good year for tight ends. But get this. From weeks 1 to 2, tight ends accounted for 11.8% of all wide receiver, running back, and tight end receiving touchdowns. That number from week 3 through week 10 is about 23%. Now, that still paces this season to have a below average touchdown share for tight ends, but it's not nearly as bad as it was during our small sample size to start the season. Not only that, but just look at general performance. Look at points per game at tight end. Right now, we're pacing towards 11 tight ends finishing the year with 10 or more PPR points per game. That's right in line with what we typically see. Last year, we were also at 11. The year before that was one of the lower marks that we've seen since 2011 when we were at 8. Okay, you're thinking to yourself, 10 points per game, that's not that high of a mark. We're looking for more elite numbers. So let's look at 12 and 14 points per game too. Right now, 4 tight ends have 12 or more PPR points per game. The average since 2011 among tight ends with 8 or more games played has typically been around 6. So we're below the mark there. And then 2 tight ends have 14 or more PPR points per game. We've typically seen a little over 3 tight ends get to that point each season. So if the season were to end today, we'd have a down year for tight ends. I think we'll probably look back and see that. But keep this in mind. Most seasons over the last decade and a half have seen tight ends start slow, which means we have to give the season more time. Because at the moment, those first 2 weeks, they're accounting for a larger share of tight end production right now. Because we've only played 10 weeks. To put that another way, tight ends are trending to do better than what these numbers are suggesting. Now, the one thing that I haven't talked about here is average draft position, and that's key. Because what I think people are frustrated with isn't only the fact that tight ends have underperformed, or their assumption that tight ends have underperformed. I think people are frustrated with the cost to acquire some of these underperforming tight ends. Here's the thing though. Back 5 or 6 years ago, we had a good idea as to who the top tight ends were going to be. You know, Gronk had his time, and then it was Kelsey. And we had Andrews in there a little bit too. We always had these 1 or 2 elite tight ends that we draft, and we were essentially guaranteed that those players would finish at the top of the position. We objectively did not have that this year. I wrote about that in my guide. I talked about that on this show. But what we did have was a pool of tight ends who had that ability, who had that upside. You see, that's the thing that's being missed with this discussion. We weren't paying the same premiums for the elite tight ends this year for a reason, because we didn't know which tight ends were actually going to be difference makers. That's why we were getting Kelsey later and McBride later and Kincaid later. We got them later than where we'd usually see a quote elite tight end. They weren't getting drafted in round 1 and 2. But what was clear to me, and this is something that I wrote about at length in the guide, this is not just hindsight stuff. What seemed clear to me was that some of those tight ends would emerge. In 2023, we hit this perfect storm of early round tight ends kind of underperforming and late round ones coming from nowhere and dominating. Sam Laporta, Jake Ferguson, Trey McBride. This year, we didn't feel as confident. And if you look at the tight end rankings right now, we were largely right. There's always going to be a tight end or two who comes from nowhere and gives us great production. And that's looking like Cade Otton this year. But it's really just Cade Otton, maybe Tucker Kraft. There aren't many out of nowhere tight ends that are giving us elite production, especially compared to what we saw last year. The top tight ends right now are George Kittle, Brock Bowers, Travis Kelce, and Trey McBride. Those are the 4 tight ends who, when we look back on the season, they're probably going to be the ones who made the biggest weekly difference, Cade Otton aside. Kelce and McBride were early round selections. George Kittle, according to Fantasy Pros ADP, he was a top 6 tight end. Brock Bowers was typically right in the top 10. I think what we've seen play out this year was kind of predictable, you guys. It seems crazy to say, but I think a lot of it is because our views are a little bit distorted by what happened in the first couple of weeks of the season. It's just that we've been really burned by Dalton Kincaid. We were burned to a degree by Kyle Pitts. We've been really burned by Sam Laporta. But what's interesting about some of those names, they were kind of predictable. Now, I didn't straight up fade those 3 guys, but I talked about the drawbacks to each one of them entering the season. Laporta was a regression candidate. Kincaid and Pitts were earlier round tight end picks who had poor previous season yards per route run rates. Typically, that wasn't a good sign. Historically, it had not been a good sign when that was the case. Now, here's what I'm getting at. We knew that these tight ends had warts. All of them. There was downside for all of these tight ends. For some of them, the downside is hit. For others, it hasn't totally hit. That was going to happen because this year was objectively different. We didn't have elite tight ends the way that we had historically had elite tight ends. But some of these tight ends that were drafted relatively early, the quote elite tight ends of 2024, they've been totally fine. Some of them have been great. George Kittle is having an unbelievable season right now. Now, maybe no one's really following this. Maybe some people just disagree. But I don't see tight end as some massive debacle this year. It started that way for sure, but it's slowly become exactly what we thought it might become. A place where some guys hit and a place where some guys busted. That's no different than any other position most seasons. And I would anticipate that the numbers, like I said earlier, I'd anticipate that they continue to favor tight ends through the end of the season, at least versus what we saw to start the year. Now, my guess is that we'll see the Kittles and the McBrides and the Bowers of the world have strong ADPs next season, but probably not reach the levels of Gronk and Kelsey in their prime. Maybe we do with Bowers and maybe McBride, but we'll see. That's because we don't have a large enough sample size to go off of for some of these players. But make no mistake, that doesn't mean that elite tight ends are dead. It just means that we have to keep playing this game each year where we're trying to nail who those tight ends are going to be. And to me, that means opportunity. It's opportunity to beat the market at the position. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB and Blue Sky as well, same exact handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you give Late Round Perspectives a listen this week. There's a lot of data talk if you're into that kind of thing. But otherwise, enjoy Week 11. I'll talk to you next week.